So thank you so much for joining us for the first installment of our Allen v. Farrow discussion series. Each week for the next 4 weeks, we will have a discussion on a different topic from each episode of the Emmy-nominated series. Today, for episode 1, we have a discussion on grooming and child protection, and I'm your moderator, Dr. Viola Vaughan-Eden. I'm a social work professor as well as a clinical and forensic social worker specializing in child sexual abuse, and I'm honored to participate in this salient discussion on understanding the process of grooming for effective child protection. Having worked with child sexual abuse victims and survivors as both a forensic evaluator and a therapist, I know all too well the role that grooming has played in their lives. Grooming has been used to manipulate children and the adults in their environment. And one of the things I've often had to explain to family and colleagues is that perpetrators perp everyone in the environment to gain access. It is not about singular focus on the child. In order to gain access, they need to manipulate the entire environment and distort and question, have people question their perceptions. So that's going to be a big part of the discussion today. And I'm really excited that we have some very outstanding speakers that I have worked with over the years, and those that I haven't worked with, I've read or seen their work. This panel discussion is a result of Jane Doe Films, as well as the Center for Judicial Excellence, the National Family Violence Law Center, and RAINN. Thank you also for the many organizations who have taken part as the host committee. You can read more about the partners and those organizations at allenvfarrowseries.com/take-action. So now to introduce you to a very dynamic panel of speakers, I'm going to give a brief bio, and again, you'll be able to read more or hear more from them later. But let's start. We have Dr. Joyanna Silberg, who's president of the Leadership Council on Child Abuse and Interpersonal Violence. Her psychotherapy practice specializes in children and adolescents in suffering from dissociative symptoms and disorders, as well as her forensic practice specializes in child sexual abuse. She has served as an expert witness in more than 27 states. Then we have Amy Herdy, who is the Emmy-winning journalist, producer, and co-creator of Allen v. Farrow. Amy has worked as a producer with Jane Doe Films on documentaries such as The Hunting Ground, On the Record, and The Bleeding Edge, for which she received the DuPont Journalism Award. She's also the author of Diary of a Predator. It's a memoir of the recounts of her coverage of Brent Brents, a notorious serial rapist. Then we have Camille Cooper, who is the Vice President of Public Policy at RAINN, where she leads the efforts at the federal and state level to improve the criminal justice system, prevent sexual assault, and ensure justice for survivors. Camille has more than 20 years of experience in federal and state legislative drafting, strategy, and lobbying on topics related to child protection, child exploitation, anti-child trafficking, as well as gender and media. And finally, we have Lundy Bancroft. Lundy has had over 25 years of experience in the field of abuse, trauma, and recovery. He has published 5 books, including Why Does He Do That? And most recently, In Custody, a Carrie Green novel. Lundy has worked with over 1,000 abusive men in his counseling groups, and he's also served extensively as a custody evaluator, child abuse investigator, and an expert witness. So I'm excited and honored to be with this dynamic group who together, I think can share so much with us, and we can learn so much from their experiences, as well as planning for future development on how to support survivors on their journey. So that said, This evening, we're going to ask questions that get us thinking, help us understand what we can do. But I'm going to pose some questions. There have been some questions that have been posed by the audience, and I'm not expecting that every single question will be answered by every single panelist. So we really want to have a nice conversation about this very important topic and ways that we can improve things for survivors. I think, however, we probably need to start with just one of the basic questions. And it's a question that I'm often asked and struggle with. But what is grooming? What is grooming all about? What does it look like? How do we know? What are some things that our audience needs to really appreciate based on some of the comments in the series when it was said repeatedly, I just didn't want to believe this was happening. I was really questioning what was happening. Does grooming do that to people? Does grooming take on that approach? So any of our panelists who would like to start, please. Dr. Silberg?
I don't mind starting. So grooming is a process that a perpetrator uses on a victim that he or she has identified as the victim. And the person who is the perpetrator does both behavioral and psychological things that prepare this victim, who at this point is a victim and will later be a survivor, to accommodate to the overtures that he makes or she makes, although it's more common for men to be groomers. Girls, women, girls, people who are women offenders do it as well. It is the process makes the victim, the child, feel more and more and more responsibility for the fact that they are doing things. They become guiltier and guiltier, and they cannot really separate what is their own feelings from the feelings of the person who is putting them in those positions. So I gave a very general. I can make it more specific, or other people can jump in with the specifics, but I kind of gave an overall general, but there's lots of specifics that follow. But I don't want to take everybody's chance away.
Okay. So, Viola, I think you raised a good point that perpetrators tend to groom the entire community. They spend their lifetime developing skills of deception. And at the core of that is their ability to be able to establish trust. And in order to do that, they ingratiate themselves. They use things like assistance, particularly, let's say you have a mom that is a single mom, she's overwhelmed, she's exhausted, she needs a break. You might have a trusted teacher that offers to take the child for an afternoon so that the mom can have a break from having to do full-time childcare and providing financially. So they're very good at ingratiating themselves and knowing what to offer as a way to sort of, as you said, gain access to that child and develop that trust and rapport. And perpetrators are incredibly patient, and grooming can exist on a continuum. So they may attempt to groom the parents for years before they actually try to have time alone with that child. Grooming also takes place online. So when we think about child exploitation, it's very common for a perpetrator to develop an online identity that's very different from their own. I'll give you a basic example. You might have a 45-year-old male who's looking to solicit children online, but he'll pose as a 16-year-old girl in order to be able to develop relationships and rapport with young boys online, and then slowly gain their trust and develop a relationship with them, become their confidant, and then ask them for images and pictures. So that's another way that children can be groomed online. And then also in the family context, fathers and stepfathers and uncles will tend to groom children. They might give the child special treatment. They might make the child feel more special than maybe some of the other siblings. They might buy them special gifts. And they might start with something that seems innocuous, like tickling, and then move down a grooming continuum in order to get to penetration. And that might take several years to do that. But those are some of the ways that what grooming can look like.
Thank you. I would like for Lundy to maybe explain to us how parents and other adults can really protect, or recognize grooming behavior so they can protect their child or children.
Well, my first thought is be really careful about excuses that you're hearing from this guy. I'll say guy for purposes of this example, for things that didn't look right to you. So you saw something that looked like boundary crossing with your child, or you saw something that your child really didn't like your child said he was holding on to me too long, or that kiss felt weird. It didn't feel like a nice kiss. It felt like a weird kiss. And the perpetrator is always going to have an excuse for that. Oh, I bumped into the child by accident, or the child was overreacting, or no, I didn't mean it that way at all. And so that's the first thing, is I would love for people to just really perk up when this school teacher or this uncle or whoever it is, or could be the dad, has just keeps making excuses for why he's pushing in on the child's boundary. And Camille was just talking about how there's this progressive process of pushing in and in on the child's boundaries and trying to get the child sort of able to live with one level of violation, so then you can move to the next level of violation. And then I think it's really important to look for whether this person is having genuine, honest relationships with other people, because you folks have been talking about the grooming of the whole environment. And I get frustrated actually with how prepared people are to be charmed by abusers. Like, oh, he's such a nice guy and he's doing this for us, he's doing that for us. And I feel like, please look a little harder and try to see how genuine this stuff is, because I feel like when we look, we can pick up the difference between someone who's being really generous and someone who's using generosity to try to get us feeling indebted or feeling like, oh, what a great guy. And the last thing I would just say is just please take your kids seriously. When your kids say that didn't feel good, don't toss it off. Don't say, oh, he didn't mean anything by that, or oh, it was just an accident. Zero in on that when your kid said, I didn't like that.
That's a really good point. I know when I first heard about grooming, or what grooming was, one of the things is that perpetrators will groom the child in such a way, or groom the environment in such a way, that you may say, hey, are you uncomfortable around so-and-so? And then once you ask, generally you don't ask again. And so that becomes this cue that, oh, now I can really start moving in, because, I've now convinced everyone in the environment that I'm safe and I'm okay. One of the things that really struck me, and I don't know, Amy, if you want to respond, is the way in which the series addressed and pulled it together. The adults were questioning, what's the difference between this loving behavior, the close behavior, and the grooming behavior? So, we saw repeatedly in the episode where several adults were really struggling with what they were witnessing. So can you tell us more about how that was pulled together?
Well, absolutely. And I think you made a really good point a moment ago about perpetrators grooming an environment, right? Which means grooming family members. And I have a 5-month-old German Shepherd puppy who's making a lot of racket in the next room. So I apologize in advance for all of that. So they groom family members, and they especially groom intimate partners, right? And gaslight them. Oh, you have nothing to be concerned about. Everything is fine. I love you. I'm committed to this relationship. I'm just being a loving parent. And so it's really, really hard, because it's the most difficult thing for anyone to wrap their mind around, right? That someone would harm a child in any way. And so they want to disbelieve it. They want to believe that this person's being honest when they're denying anything is inappropriately going on. So it's so very difficult. And I think that's the biggest piece, is to recognize when an entire family has been groomed. It could be, a good friend of an older child. It could be a relative who's often in the home. It could be a member of their church. There are lots and lots of ways that people insert themselves into children's lives in order to gain access.
Good, all very good points. Thank you. And this is open to any of you. Really, how often is grooming recognized, like when it's happening versus only acknowledged in retrospect?
I think Mia Farrow recognized it, but she second guessed herself. And I think that there were those moments that her neighbor, who was the therapist, also recognized it. The friend of the family who saw him getting Dylan to suck his thumb recognized it. They all had that sort of sick feeling, like something wasn't right. And then in came this sort of voice that said, oh, it can't be that, right? Which is what Amy is talking about. So I think, there's a book, Gavin de Becker's The Gift of Fear. And I think that it's the same thing with this, where we really need to trust our intuition. When you get an icky feeling, when you're sort of watching an adult interact with a child and it makes you feel like that's not right, you really need to trust that and talk with the child, or talk to someone else that can talk to the child.
And I just want to add, and I completely agree, by the way, Camille, and I just wanted to add that with Alan D. Farrow, one of the things that shocked me the most when I was in conversations with Dylan was that it had not been a one-time event of her being molested that she recalled, which the entire world thought, because that's what everyone had been told to believe. And I had also believed that to be true, that it all culminated in one afternoon where she named, her father as a perpetrator. And I found that simply wasn't true, that there, as we detailed in the series, there was example after example after example of behavior that people witnessed and described in great detail, like the application of the sunscreen on her when she was a toddler, the sucking of the thumb, the always pulling her aside and taking her off so that they could have private time together. The fact that she started running away when he would come to the house, and hiding and acting like an animal. All of those signs that were there, that when you look at them with hindsight, they make perfect sense. But at the time, it was all missed. And this also, we have to keep in mind of the time frame. This is early 90s when there just wasn't as much awareness. And I hope that the lesson that that anyone can take from this who has a child in their life is that there are lots of ways that these signs manifest, and to always be aware.
I would love to pipe in on that one too, that I think there's a lot of confusion about child sexual molesters. And there's the idea that they're all sort of one thing, and they're actually a number of different styles of child sexual abuser. And the style that's most in the newspaper is what people refer to as the pedophile, which is or more properly, predatory child molester, going after like dozens and dozens of kids, is usually going to primarily target boys, even though his adult sexuality tends to be heterosexual, but may also target girls. And most of those are going to be one-time encounters. And he's often a kind of like not a guy that doesn't have a great social life. And we think of him as kind of a loser style of guy. And an incest perpetrator, according to the research, and we find from case experiences, is completely different from the pedophile. He's popular usually. He's not at all a loser type. He's usually a pretty like cool, well-liked kind of person. And he's not going to have one-time assaults. That's very uncommon for the incest perpetrator. The incest perpetrator tends to offend again and again and again against the same person. That pedophile may have 100 victims that he's offended against one time. The incest perpetrator, on average, tends to have 1 or 2 victims that he's offended against over and over and over again. And so it's and he tends to actually go more after girl children than after boy children. So it's a completely different style of offending. And one reason the incest perpetrator gets away with it is because people look at it and think, oh, well, this guy's not a pedophile. Like he doesn't look anything like a pedophile, so he's probably not abusing this girl. And there's no reason why he should look anything like a pedophile. That's a completely different style of offending.
Thank you for that, because that is so important for people to understand. I think one of the questions kind of to follow up with that is then what do we do for parents to help them recognize whether, is there any training available, or what can we offer them so that they know when they're seeing it? Because I think it's important we say that you need to listen and believe your child, but part of grooming is this notion that, I'm the upstanding citizen in church. I'm your friend that you can leave your child with. I'm your, sometimes, your brother, your, son, your husband. What is it that people need to know, like that we can train them to recognize?
I would say, as a parent, to start observing things about someone who has inserted themselves in your life. Are they searching for one-on-one time with my child? Are they bringing gifts to me or the family or my child? An inordinate amount of gifts, right? Does the relationship appear to be becoming more and more exclusive? Those sorts of things. I think they should be very, very careful about who they allow alone time with their children. I'm so concerned when I see babysitting services, for example, and in the day and age of COVID, I know we're all desperate for any kind of escape, any kind of a break, but I'm seeing these, these babysitters are screened, and, if you just need to get out, you just call this service and they'll come by. That's a total stranger in someone's home. And I cringe every time I see one of those things. But, the more insidious threats are the people that the family knows and trusts.
So it sounds like just overall education about what child sexual abuse is, and the whole process is so important. I think the exclusivity, the isolating was so striking in the film and the episode, where Dylan was being isolated, even when she had friends at the house waiting to play with her, wanting to play with her, even when she had siblings there that wanted to engage. There was definitely this isolating. So I think you make a really good point, Amy, that recognizing when someone wants to take your child off or offer to babysit, even if you're really tired and really wanted, that you might really need to think through what ulterior motives might exist. And, at the end of the day, even if it doesn't, you don't want to open that door for the possibility of something to happen. One of the things that I know, Joy, as a psychologist, you work with more extreme cases in which children and adolescents struggle with dissociative behavior because they're really struggling to cope with, is this really happening to me, and how do I manage that? Can you tell us more about that?
I will, but I want to make two other points really quickly first, and then I will. One is I wanted to pick up on the theme that you were talking about isolation, getting the child to feel that the only one they can count on is the perpetrator. And it was subtle and fast. It went by fast in the film, but there is a part where you hear Dylan explain that she was told bad things about her mother. Like her mother doesn't really love her and doesn't really have time for her. And her mother is too busy with the other children. And her mother is this. And so that attempt to destroy the bond in some way, that is so incredibly telling and is so lethal. And it is hard to pick up, but you can actually pick it up. Sometimes kids will blurt out things like, oh, my friend Stevie thinks that you just work too hard. You hear something like that, You might think that's an innocent thing, but that's not an innocent thing, because that means that somebody's been putting ideas in that child's mind that's somewhat negative about the relationship. So you really need to be alert to that. I just wanted to point that part out about the isolation. The other thing I wanted to say was, think of the expression too good to be true. And if you get that feeling, maybe it's just not true. And now I will quickly answer your dissociation question very quickly. Basically, what you see in the film and what you see with any dissociative person is an intense, intense, intense conflict. I have to be here. I don't want to be here. I love this person. I hate this person. I want this to happen. I don't want this to happen with all of my might. A person can't live in a state of such intense conflict all of the time. So what do they do when that conflict is there? They go inside of themselves, pretend they're not there, pretend it's not happening. They eventually dissociate from the experience, develop other selves that it's happening to. So that's what we're looking at. We're looking at that intensity of conflict. Yes, Dylan was loving her father. Yes, Dylan was really hating the moments she spent with him. How can both be true? When two things cannot both be true, the only choice you have is to dissociate.
Thank you for that. And thank you for bringing up the whole notion of the specialness. You're special to me, and the recognizing of isolating as a means of psychological abuse as well. I think that's so important for people. The subtlety was, your mom likes your siblings better than she likes you. That was one of the things that was said. And so I think that is crazy making. That's just a way of, I think, real world term is crazy making, but ultimately you're right. It becomes dissociative as a form of just coping with the stress, because I can't really be this special if at the same time this is happening to me and I don't want it to happen to me. So there are some internal struggles that children experience. I think the other thing that would be really good to hear a little more about is, how do men talk about grooming behaviors? And I know, Lundy, you've written so much about this, and I've read a number of your books. I had to get them on Kindle now because, I review them a lot of times before I go into court. What's happening with the men that you've worked with?
I think it varies, but I think with, sometimes men's grooming behavior is like almost automatic. Like they absorb these kinds of ways of operating from male influences that they had growing up, and from pornography and from other sources. And they almost don't have to be conscious to do it. They just do it kind of automatically. But I think, particularly with the incest perpetrator, there tends to be considerable consciousness to what he's doing. He knows. And once in a while, like I ran groups for abusers for years, and they would sometimes get sort of inadvertently maybe a little more honest than they intended to be. And they would say things like, oh, well, you've got to get them trusting you, or, oh, you got to kind of, it's like catching a fish, you got to draw them in. And so the truth would come out in certain ways, and you'd see that there actually tends to be some remarkable consciousness about the grooming behavior. And you would also see how justified they would feel in what they were doing. And this is one thing that's quite surprising to people who haven't dealt with perpetrators. You always assume that they must be sort of, even while they're doing these terrible things, they must be simultaneously kind of ashamed of the fact that they're doing it. And unfortunately, they're typically not. Typically, they're astoundingly justified and smug. And I had a guy who was a confirmed, a caught incest perpetrator in one of my groups, who said to me, well, no one has the right to tell me how to raise my kids. And in other words, his thinking was so twisted that he had turned sexual exploitation of children into like a way of raising kids. It's like a style of child rearing. That's really, really twisted, destructive, dehumanizing thinking.
Well, and I totally agree with you on that, but I'm also thinking about, our system of government, our judicial system is really based on this notion that women and children are property. And we've gradually moved away from that, but I do think that that's part of this underlying piece is what he's saying. No one can tell me what to do with my child because this child is my property. What do we think the family court is getting wrong in these types of cases?
Well, almost everything. The family court is hardly ever getting it right at this point in history. It's gotten so bad. And I know some people are going to be angry at me for saying that, but there's an almost complete refusal at this point in history to actually look at the evidence. So that's one issue. Secondly, people on the panel have already talked about this long-standing gender stereotype that women are just overreactors and are hysterical and are just making something out of nothing. So that's a really big thing. And then if there's such a widespread thing that a popular, successful guy would not be an abuser of women and would not be an incest perpetrator. It's like, oh no, that would be a loser guy who's like whatever, drug addicted or poor or out of work. Like a successful movie director wouldn't be an incest perpetrator. He's not a loser. And the other thing that the courts refuse to have any awareness of is multiple research studies. I know of 7 or 8 different research studies that have found that a man who abuses women, who abuses his adult partners, is much more likely than other men to be a perpetrator of incest towards children, particularly towards girls that are exposed to him. And in a case like this, where there's so much history, evidence of history of abuse towards adult females, and I understand that's going to be more of a coming issue in the next episode, there's just all these warning signs. And the court, unfortunately, takes the opposite attitude. The court says, well, she says he's been a domestic violence perpetrator, and now she's also accusing him of incest. That's very suspicious. She must be up to something. Rather than saying, oh, well, statistically, there's a big overlap between those two things. We better investigate this very thoroughly and in an unbiased, objective way.
Exactly. And I don't know, Camille, can you want to add something to that? Because I really want to know about the professionals that go into court. We have not only family therapists and other experts that are having to present to courts, but we have guardian ad litem, attorneys who are there to win their side of the case, regardless of the outcome, and judges who I know in my state really have very little training and very little education about family dynamics before they're put on the bench to make decisions in these very difficult cases.
Yeah, I think it's important for everyone to understand that when someone becomes a judge, they might be coming out of a real estate practice or wills and trusts. And then they get put on the bench and they might not have any experience or knowledge or expertise on domestic violence and sexual abuse. But they also come to the bench with a whole worldview and a lifetime of bias. One of the things that gets said over and over and over again, whether it's from law enforcement or social services or judges or CASA or guardian ad litems, is the second that there's a child sexual abuse allegation in the context of two people that have never been married or are separated in divorcing or are previously divorced, is, oh, that's a custody case. So there's this automatic bias that gets sort of overlaid on these cases from the get-go, and they never really receive any type of really qualitative criminal investigative response from the system itself. So the system fails these children from the get-go because it's discriminating against the child based on the parents' relationship to each other and whether they're divorced or separated or not, right? And we know that child sexual abuse occurs in divorced families as often as it would in intact families because the divorce rate is so high. So it's not like it only happens in intact families, it's happening everywhere. And a lot of times a child will wait to disclose until the parents have separated because then they finally feel safe that they can say something about daddy. So judges have all these biases, guardian ad litems have all of these biases. And then what happens is you don't get this really qualitative investigative response. And then the judge comes in and they see it in a courtroom where they've spent every day with litigating parents who are fighting over who gets the car or who gets the lawnmower. And they see it as an extension of this acrimony that's happening in the context of divorce. And so that's another layer of bias that ends up sort of tainting the judge's ability to be able to be objective in these cases. We've been working on some legislation in Maryland to try to get mandatory training for judges. And what we have found is across the board, judges are opposed to getting training specifically on these cases, even though it's probably one of the most impactful and most important decisions that they can ever make in a child's life. They're sort of refusing to make that effort to get enough continuing education that they can really understand the dynamics and what's happening. And that's a very disturbing trend that we're seeing as we're working on these sort of legislative proposals, is the deep reluctance of judges to educate themselves.
What I was thinking about as you were talking about judges is the absence of the voice of the child in the courtroom and the negating of the voice of the child in the courtroom. So many times I hear what is so clearly an authentic expression from a child disparaged or said, well, kids don't talk like that, when it's obvious kids talk like that. For example, I was in a courtroom where the child had stated, oh, my daddy likes his bottle better than he likes me. And that they were using that as proof that he was coached into not liking the fact that his father was drinking. But he'd also been in the middle of an accident with his father when his father had been drinking. He'd also seen his father laying on the ground, passed out. The idea that a child wouldn't say that and that the facts of the actual case can be overshadowed by twisting the words of children is just shocking to me. Kids are authentic. They can speak, and they can speak very clearly about what they perceive and what they feel. And I don't think we've figured it out yet. We have not yet figured out how that child's voice is going to get to be heard. It's not with the attorneys that represent the child or the guardian ad litems that supposedly represent the child very often, because often they feel it's their job to do what they think and not what the child clearly, flatly tells them in their own words. So I feel that is one of the basic things missing for judicial trainings, is understanding how children think, how children talk, when children are hurt, the way they say it. These are things that really need to be explained and understood.
I mean, I think that's such a good point. And as you all are all talking, I'm really thinking about this continuum. We definitely need to overhaul the judicial system and educate attorneys and judges. But back to something Camille said earlier, is the fact that even child protective service workers need to be educated around investigation, because she's absolutely right. I remember the first time a parent told me that CPS would not consider taking her case because she was going through a divorce. And I was appalled and shocked and couldn't quite believe it until I called on the phone and said, what's going on? Oh, they're going through a divorce, so it's just likely. To think that someone would completely disrupt their life to make these allegations, as well as traumatize their child, is another distressing thing. Because you wouldn't. There are so many other ways to be vindictive than to make false allegations of sexual abuse. I'm wondering a little bit more about what is it that we need to do from a policy standpoint? We clearly need to educate across the board, but CAPT has been out since 1974, CAPTA, the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act, that established social services and so much of what child protection as we know it today. So it hasn't been that long, but we have so far to go. So what kinds of recommendations do you all have for some of the next legislation?
I mean, I think the CAPTA is part of the problem, right? So under CAPTA, the feds bifurcated child sexual abuse investigations. And then based on your relationship to your perpetrator, your case gets triaged to a non-criminal investigator or a social worker. So instead of getting a cop on your case doing surveillance and polygraphing and interrogation and looking at digital media and all these other things that cops have the authority to do, you get a social worker who goes out to the crime scene. And that's like sending a social worker out to a meth lab and asking the people there if they have a drug problem before the drug task force gets there. So CAPT is actually part of the problem because we bifurcated it and discriminated based on relationship to the perpetrator. So that needs to be fixed. And we really need to fund and mandate this multidisciplinary team approach, because social services plays a vital role in terms of continuing safety planning for the child. But they really shouldn't be first responder in the investigative role. They should be secondary responder in the protection aspect and safety and therapeutic services referrals. And so we have it a little mixed up. We need to really focus in on that multidisciplinary team approach. You have the Child Advocacy Center, you have everybody there at the interview together, and you have a very robust criminal investigation where they're actually issuing search warrants. Because I think if we did a study nationally of how many child sexual abuse cases, whether they were family cases or just regular CPS cases, had a search warrant issued in the case for evidence, whether it was evidence in the home or evidence on the computer, we would see a lot more findings, substantiations, and arrests, because right now we're not even looking for the evidence because there's no one's issuing consent searches or search warrants on these cases. I think that's one thing we could do legislatively is mandate that. You could mandate that through CAPTA. You could mandate every state have to have a multidisciplinary team in every locality. And then you can mandate how that team is supposed to function. There's a lot of law enforcement agencies that say, oh, we don't really work well with social services. And that just isn't acceptable. That's just not okay. So we can do that legislatively and mandate that. And we should. I know there's a couple good laws. Caden's law is in VAWA. Everyone should be supporting that. There's, like in Maryland, we're working on this mandatory judicial training. And then also there's, I think, a study that Congress has asked the Department of Justice to do specific to these cases. So there's a lot that we can do legislatively.
Thank you. And thank you for that review. That is so important. I have to give a little shout out about social workers, though. Many people, like Camille explained earlier about judges and the little training that they have. Sadly, social workers are often not trained about child abuse, and they actually, even undergraduate and graduate social workers really don't receive. We don't have a lot of classes about child abuse and neglect. So even my university, we've had a social work program now since the mid 60s. We're just really starting to say, okay, we're sending you out to child protective agencies. We need to have a class and have a semester where we actually teach you what child abuse looks like. So I'm mindful of the time. And one of the things I think I'd like to do is ask Amy if we know there are many more episodes and we're looking forward to seeing that. You've done a number of documentaries, and how does this work on this particular one tie in with some of your previous work and where you see this documentary going?
You know, what we see time and time again is that when the survivor tells their story, they are shamed and blamed, and their story is shot down by a lot of people in authority around them. And, you know, DARVO, which was deny, attack, reverse, victim, and offender, is a classic playbook that I've seen play out time and time again, whether it's you're talking about sexual assault on college campuses or sexual assault in the military, or, you know, cases within a family of incest allegations. It plays out time and time again. And so our culture in particular shames and blames victims, and it's still ongoing, and we're chipping away at it. And the Me Too movement helped, but it certainly didn't eradicate it. And so there's a lot of work still to be done there. And there are some concrete things, that we can do, like some of the reforms you talked about a moment ago, but, trying to expose these stories and these cases wherever we can, it helps. But, the work of these people here on this panel is so incredibly important in doing this work on behalf of survivors.
Thank you. And I really want to echo that sentiment and thank this panel. We have, wow, what many of you may not know is that this group of people have committed their lives, their entire career, their work, life's work has been about supporting and helping protect victims and helping survivors recover and realize that this doesn't have to be their defining moment in life. And so the commitment of a lifetime to have such an amazing panel come together is so appreciative. I really do appreciate all of what everyone on this panel has contributed to support victims and survivors. And I also want to thank again Jane Doe Films for such a powerful series, a series that really has meaning and really gives voices to so many that have been voiceless. So I want to thank all of our audience for joining us tonight. A recording of this panel will remain available on YouTube, as well as Jane Doe Films has a Facebook page that you can revisit or share. And also just remind you, if you need more information on our partners and our host committee, please visit allenbfarrowseries.com/take action. Thank you so much and have a wonderful evening.